Welcome along. It's an interview day today, back on the Red Star Radio podcast. And today I'm very pleased to be joined again for the second time by Carlos Garrido of Midwestern Marx. He's the founder and co-editor of Midwestern Marx, and he's here today to talk about his most recent work, which is entitled The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. Carlos, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me back. It was a very enjoyable talk that we had last time, and I hope to have something along the same lines this time.
Yes, it's a very interesting work, and of course a very pertinent one, given the state of the left in both your country and mine. I think the two lefts share a lot in common, and reading your work about the objective state of things in the United States, it seems to be that you have many similar problems to what some of us in this country are trying to wrestle with here. But I wanted to start with the title of Purity Fetish, because it's quite an interesting way of putting it. Could you explain to listeners and viewers who maybe are a little bit confused by that, like what exactly is it that you're referring to with that term?
Right. Well, the purity fetish is a concept that I first developed, I believe, in October 2021 in the form of an article, which ended up getting quite some sharing around. It was translated into a few different languages and published in various magazines, and it became a central concept for me and the folks at the Midwestern Marx Institute to think through some of the flaws that we were observing in the contemporary American left. And at the time when I first developed the concept, it referred specifically to the way in which I felt the dominant form in which the Western Marxist tradition, which isn't just like a geographical category, even though it's not non-geographical, right? In the West, you've had communist parties that haven't had some of these flaws. But the way that the Western Marxist tradition approached their rejections and condemnations of socialism and socialist experiments, which of course have primarily taken root in the global East and in the global South. And the way that I saw that was through the purity fetish. They have the certain set of almost grocery list-like lists of things that when achieved, that means that you have socialism, these pure ideas of what socialism is, and they obsess over these pure checklists. And if a country, if a real-life socialist experiment does not measure up to these pure ideals, then they are condemned. That's that was the essence of the idea when I was first developing it. It was in part piggying back on or developing an analysis that was already somewhat present in a Brazilian communist named Jones Manel, who was elaborating a similar concept of the fetish of defeat on the basis of his analysis of Domenico Losordo's work, specifically the book Western Marxism, which is just being translated into English with a new introduction from one of our comrades, Gabriel Rockhill and Jennifer Ponce de Leon. And in this book, similar themes are threaded out, and part of what the analysis that they produce say that this ideological flaw is rooted in is in the tradition of Christianity and Messianism that embeds the worldview of the Western Marxists and blinds them in many ways to the fact that these are flaws and incompatible with the Marxist worldview. Part of what I do in my extension of that argument is show that this worldview is only present in Christianity because it's already present in the debates on the question of change in Greek philosophy that take root 500 years before there even is a Christ. And what I end up doing, what I did in that article and what I develop more thoroughly and in a more refined fashion in the book is show genealogically how the origins of this worldview, which ideologically grounds the positioning of Western Marxism and American Marxists, how it can be traced to this Eleatic worldview, the school of philosophy that was called the Eleatics, The primary thinker was a figure by the name of Parmenides, and one of his students, Zeno. And for that school, that which was true was comparable to that which was one, to a one that was homogeneous, so that didn't allow of contradiction. Contradiction was something that if it showed up, it was a signified falseness, it signified the way of opinion, it signified that something in your thought went wrong. Change was considered to be an illusion. And these were debates that were being engaged with another key philosopher, Heraclitus, who postulated in the first dialectical philosopher, basically, that everything is in constant flux, that the existence of this flux is rooted in the fact that there's contradictions within everything, and that, yes, there is such a thing as a totality, a one, but that one includes within it the many. That means that, wholes are not homogeneous. They don't have complete uniformity inside. There is the existence of contradictions, of what we would call later a unity and struggle of opposites within things. And so I phrased the ideological grounds of the Western Marxism, this purity fetish outlook, which I trace back to this Asiatic school. And I say that the outlook that is in contradistinction to this, although I don't think the two are, from the lens of the development of the history of philosophy, incompatible. The Asiatic outlook played a specific role in certain moments in history that was progressive, and it naturally, through its own contradictions, gave way to a moment in history where a figure like Hegel or a figure like Marx and Engels and Lenin can take up the spirit of Heraclitus in their philosophy and refine it further through a more concrete analysis. And the part of the paradoxes which I see at play is that in a variety of these Western Marxist figures, whether it's Adorno, Marcuse, Kevin Anderson, which is someone who is still alive, still writing, part of the paradox is that they very much emphasize that their projects are framed sometimes in the form of going back to Hegel, understanding Marx through going back to Hegel. That's something that's very much explicit in Zizek. He would add Lacan as well, but it's going back to Hegel to avoid the mistakes of the Soviet Marxism, which is also an absurd category, which they hold that the Soviet Marxism was mechanistic, it was vulgar, it wasn't actually dialectical, it was actually positivist. And the paradox that I show is that while sometimes they produce, enjoyable and worthwhile texts on dialectics, for instance, Marcuse's Reason and Revolution is a text I still recommend for people who are trying to go through Hegel and understand Hegel. While they can do that in one sphere, when it comes to political analysis, to taking the general principles and seeing how they're at play in the particular, which is part of the essence of dialectical analysis, they completely fail. They assume that socialism can, from one day to another, take up the ideal forms which were presented in certain conclusions in various texts in Marx or in Engels or in Lenin. They assume that that the purity markers that they have up, which are not incompatible with certain ideals that we want to work towards, it's not like they're wrong. What they're wrong about is the way that they use that purity to condemn reality. And in doing so, they have nothing in common with Marx and Engels, who, think of communism through various temporalities. They have, yes, that ideal end society that's classless, stateless, moneyless, where interactions are unmediated. But they also think of communism in terms of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which since their writings has just been thought of as socialism. And they also think about communism in terms of this phrase that appears in the German ideology and then later on in the manifesto of the Communist Party, which is communism as the real movement of history which abolishes the present state of things. And I think that when you look at, for instance, Marx's analysis of the Paris Commune, he says it almost very explicitly. He was analyzing what forms that real movement of history, that real class struggle that won for a short period of time, what forms did it discover? So the essence is this materialist analysis of the movement of class struggle and what forms it creates, which means that any idea of getting these preordained a priori classifications through which you can measure reality to see how impure it is, and then keep those ideas in the realm of purity, because then they say, well, that's not actually socialism, right? The USSR wasn't actually socialism. China's not actually, Cuba's not actually socialism. Therefore, the idea stays pure. It doesn't get desecrated by the meanness of trying to construct socialism in a reality of imperialist hybrid warfare, of various operations done to undermine socialism, economic, political, military, biochemical, very, very forms of warfare that these socialist countries are forced to exist in, and it's it loses the essence of Marxism. I struggle to even call it Marxism when that's what the analysis is, because it's nothing like how Marx, Engels, or Lenin approached the world. They learned from the world. They learned from material reality and the objective developments in society. They didn't expect those to measure up to ideals in order to realize that, okay, I can support this, but not that.
Well, yes, you raise a lot of interesting points there. I think the one thing that occurred to me, first of all, was the savior must be dead for him to be the savior, and he can never really come back. Perhaps that's why so many Protestants insist there must be 1,000 years of perfect, sinless world before the savior can return. And perhaps that's what the attitude of many Trotskyites is. But to draw on some things you said there, Carlos, I find that this reminded me of the phrase from Stalin, which was that the ultra-leftist deviation is in reality a rightist one, or something along those lines. And I was reminded of that whilst reading through your book. And when you come to a figure such as, let's just pluck one out of the air, such as Rosa Luxemburg, she is acceptable. Now, no shade on her as a revolutionary, and she was a great revolutionary and died for it, and probably wouldn't want her legacy to be distorted by opportunists and revisionists as it is. But they're all allowed to revere her because she is safely dead and buried and murdered by social democrats, which makes her canonization by social democrats very ironic, to say the least. You're allowed to idealize Salvador Allende, undoubtedly a very brave man, leading a real struggle, but unfortunately a flawed one, which was destroyed by imperialism and its local collaborators. And you're allowed to idealize the Paris Commune because it failed and it's safely buried in the past. And I wondered if part of this is because in the Western left, you can make a good career for yourself in British terms as a union bureaucrat, as an acceptable talking head on television, as an ultra-leftist who, when it comes to the big questions, supports, in our country, it would be the Labour Party. In your country, it would be the Democrats. And we've even had the case of, there was one character back in the 20s and 30s, a guy called Herbert Reed, who was an anarchist who took a knighthood to become a knight of the realm, whilst retaining, of course, a perfect, pure, stateless ideal. And it seems that old phrase of Stalin's is relevant here, because it's very easy. It's actually quite easy to become an ultra-leftist and be accepted by all manner of establishment thinkers and in institutions, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's what has become the most indispensable in terms of the ideological legitimation of capitalism, right? This is something that George Lukács, in his book, The Destruction of Reason, lays out very, very well, how it is that at the imperialist stage of capitalism, its emergence, which, you could argue with Lenin that it begins in the 1890s. You could argue with other folks that it begins in the fall of Reconstruction, which is something that Du Bois points out, or in the fall of the Paris Commune. That period, regardless, it brings about a sense in bourgeois philosophy where to defend the order successfully, direct apologetics is not enough. The vast majority of people are experiencing difficulties in their everyday life, and this PragerU thing. I don't know if you guys get the PragerU stuff.
Oh, they've popped up. They've got their British equivalent who are just as bad, but are more patronizing and pretentious.
This Prager, it doesn't work for the vast majority of people. Like I would, look at their Facebook comments and the reactions. Most of the reactions are like people laughing at the posts that are promoted, and there's countless money tossed so that it's spread wide. So direct apologetics of capitalist imperialism no longer works. So they need indirect apologetics, which means taking a radical veneer, presenting yourself as radical, as countercultural, but never attacking the essence of the system, never looking at political economy, never looking at imperialism, and always focusing within the domain of culture, treating certain issues from a very much ahistorical and eternalist perspective. And that is just continuously intensified in how it's done as capitalism develops and its objective contradictions become more acute. So yes, of course, what loses, the struggles that lose and that are defeated very quickly are the ones that can be supported, because those are the ones that did not have enough time to desecrate the purity of the idea, because they lost very quickly. So that Allende is an example that I use, Sankara is another example that I use, and that doesn't mean that that we shouldn't learn from them. Of course we should learn from them, but the reason why these Western Marxists idealize them, it's because they lost quick. Because if take Allende, what did Fidel Castro tell him when they met in 71? They're coming for you.
Yeah.
They're coming for you. You better prepare. I don't care how many peaceful transfers of power you've had in Chile. There's never been a peaceful transfer of power from one class to another. They're going to come for you. You better prepare. He didn't necessarily prepare, and there you have the result. Now, had he prepared and had he taken these measures to protect the revolution, which would have been called by the Western Marxists dictatorial and authoritarian, revolution might have survived, it might have not. But what is basically guaranteed is that if those measures would have been taken and it would have survived, Allende would have been treated in the same way that Kim Il-sung is treated, in the same way that Stalin is treated, and Lenin in some circles, and Mao and stuff. Because it would have had to desecrate its purity in order to ensure what is the most important part as soon as the socialist revolution triumphs, which is sustaining power, sustaining hegemony, fighting off imperialism, fighting off the national bourgeoisie that's trying to collaborate with imperial. That's the main thing. And that's there's a turn in Lenin after the revolution succeeds, where he's like, well, okay, how do we develop a more efficient state at doing not just the things as good as the bourgeoisie did it before, but better? How do we develop a state that can protect the revolution from imperialist attacks, and what we would now use the term hybrid warfare, imperialist hybrid warfare? How do we do that? And it's the same questions that are asked by the Chinese and the same questions that are asked by the Cubans. And whereas the Western Marxist has his ideal of the abolition of the state, that's the long-term idea of communism. They want to see it right then and there. The people that are actually engaged in struggle, they want to develop a strong state so that they can protect their revolutions from imperialist attacks. So when you measure up what socialist experiment you're going to support in accordance with who measures up to those ideals, you're going to essentially reject every single experiment of actually existing socialism that has lasted for any substantial period of time. And that's what the imperialists want, right? They're okay with a Marxism that rejects actually existing socialism, that accepts the great myth of empire, which is that socialism has always failed. They're perfectly fine with it. They not only are they fine with it, they consider it indispensable for all the young people, some of them coming from working class backgrounds, going into the academy, wanting to learn something that allows them to have a worldview that gives them clarity in their critique of capitalism. They want people to go to their Adorno, to their Horkheimer, to their Zizeks, to anyone that says, that flirts with Marxism, that adds a little bit of other eclectic sources like your Heidegger and stuff and your Nietzsche, but that at the end of the day is willing to delegitimize socialist experiments from the left and play an essential role in legitimizing empire when it needs to do it. And I mean, look at Zizek now. He's the darling of the NATO forces. It's despicable. And he did the same thing with Yugoslavia. There was recently a paper from Gabriel Rockhill on Zizek, the imperialism's court jester or something like that. It did a wonderful job at mapping out Zizek's history as an agent of what I've called controlled counter-hegemony, or what he calls a radical recuperator, someone who presents this radical veneer so that in the moments of crisis, when people are looking for ways to criticize the system, to understand it, and to fight for a new world, he recuperates them into a fold that doesn't actually oppose the existing order, that has a very pessimistic view about moving beyond capitalism, because every time it's been tried, it's failed, right? So if it's failed, it's the perfect form of socialist opposition. It's the form of socialist opposition that accepts Thatcher's Tina. There's no alternative. What more is there to say? That's exactly what the imperialists need in order to legitimize their order.
Well, yes, if Allende had taken Castro's advice, at best he'd be remembered like Hugo Chavez is, essentially, who the entire Western left turned on when things started getting serious. They loved him until about 2002. Then, of course, it's no coincidence that the entry of the Venezuelan masses onto the scene in a serious and consistent way scared off a lot of these Western Marxists, to the point where I remember over 10 years ago, I was in Belgium at a Trotskyite party's summer school I was in at the time. And there was an American guy there who was organizing the section of this party in Venezuela and Bolivia. And most of what he talked about was opposition to Chavez at the time, and then Maduro, and then, of course, opposition to the traitor Morales in Bolivia. That was what he talked about. Imperialism wasn't mentioned. And the more you think about like the British left, which is what I've experienced the most of the time, they don't mention imperialism. They don't talk about it. They will, in passing, reference Lenin's imperialism, but they won't tell you to read it. They will talk about British capitalism, but they won't talk about British imperialism. They will fetishize the 45 to 51 Labour Party government and the social democratic reforms, but they won't critique that in terms of how that was paid for, which was an increased exploitation of the Malaysian colonized peoples, the brutal repression of the Kenyan people, the Gulag system, very real prison camp system that the British Empire erected in Kenya and other African nations, all swept under the rug. And that's because in Britain, and I want to get your comment on this about the American situation, the entire left, other than some very small Marxist-Leninist holdouts, will idolize that social democratic period and fetishize it. They'll call Labour Party sellouts, they'll curse Keir Starmer till up and down, but when the heat is on, as you said about Zizek backing up imperialism when it matters, they'll back up the Labour Party when it matters. And it seems that you have a similar problem there, which is this, most of the American left fetishizes FDR and that period. They will talk about the pressure the working class put on to get those reforms, which is correct, that did happen. But again, they will then neglect America's role coming out of World War II as the imperialist hyperpower. Is that an accurate way of putting it?
Yeah, I would definitely say so, and reject an assessment that is absolutely necessary, which is even the victories, the victorious reforms that were achieved during FDR, there were concessions that were done to prevent a more radical departure from the existing state of affairs. And those sorts of concessions and reforms, when they're giving out within a state that is still bourgeois, where the capitalist class is still in power, are subject to recall at any moment. And right after the end of World War II, you have in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act. People forget that in the mid-40s was when the U.S. had the highest rates of strikes, right? We tend to think about, oh, mid-40s, 50s, that's the height of the middle class, the golden era of American capitalism. That was when workers were getting the things that they had won in the previous period taken back, right? Because that's what ends up happening when you get reforms. Reforms calm workers for a period of time, and then when the labor movement is weakened by their operations within the organs of worker powers and the communist parties and socialist parties, when that weakening takes place, that's when all the gains are rolled back, and it ends up in a condition where we're at now. Now we have certain elements of the union movement that are accepting socialism, and that have, for instance, Chris Smalls, who just he was the leader who organized the Amazon Labor Union. He just traveled to Cuba, met with President Diaz-Canel, and has definitely what I infer to be a break in the sort of trade union consciousness that has existed even in the most militant parts of the labor movement. And his union was organized, of course, by members of the Communist Party as well that were in New York. But you have this, the importance, I think, of the purity fetish, and one of the reasons why myself and other folks in the Institute have found it helpful for understanding reality is that it allows us to see all of these different flaws that appear sometimes from the ultra leftist, sometimes from the right opportunist. It allows us to see these flaws as not disconnected, right? Which means that it allows us to see the different forms that this controlled counter-hegemony takes in an interconnected manner. It allows us to read it and understand it dialectically. Because, for instance, with the ultra left, their positions on China, I mean, I don't know how much clear case you have of the purity fetish, because China doesn't purely measure up to the ideal of a fully centralized command state economy with no markets. It's rejected. Instead of seeing how it was that after 78, new discoveries in the construction and development of socialism are made that force us to understand the importance and indispensability of developing the forces of production, the science and technology, security apparatuses of the state. Instead of learning what new forms China discovers, which is what a big part of the global South is doing, even the countries that are not headed by socialist governments, instead of learning that, they see these measures and they say, oh, that doesn't measure up to the ideals, and therefore it must be rejected. It's actually capitalism, right? And there's a wide variety of ways in which their inability to read contradictions and to read China's development as a process and to have the social totality in view. There's a wide variety of ways in which this purity fetish manifests itself in various areas. For instance, the fact that capital does exist in China, and to very large extents, there are billionaires in China, there is markets in China, and a lot of activity is done through the market, doesn't negate the fact that private ownership and markets are both auxiliaries of the state command economy and of socialist, properly socialist property. And what people fail to understand is that when you have the social totality and they point out, oh, but there's capitalist private property here and there's markets there, therefore it's not socialist, they assume that a mode of life, a mode of production is only one, that there's only one form of production. When if you look at the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, if you just study modes of life themselves, you realize that there's a dominant form of production, and then all the other auxiliary forms of production that exist around it are mediated by that dominant form of production. That takes place within capitalism, and that's taking place within the socialist market economy that China has. But because it doesn't measure up to this pure ideal, the Western left rejects it. And of course, the cries of authoritarian capitalism or state capitalism in the non-Leninist derogatory sense, they come out. Another example of this through parts of the ultra left is a phenomenon which I focus on in the case of the U.S. It exists in parts of Europe, but there's very much the development of something that Georgy Dimitrov called national nihilism in the U.S., where because America's history is impure, because it contains, of course, very hideous parts, the enslavement of Black people, the genocide of the natives, imperialism, and it's a horrendous history. Because it contains that, then that negative part, it's treated synecdochally as the social totality. And so America ends up being reduced to that negative part. And this ignores the fact that within the social totality of America, there's an objective contradiction where there's that pole, and then in the underbelly of that history, there's a history of struggles. And that history is not outside of America, as many of them tried to paint. They say, these progressive struggles, they were struggles against America. That's not the case. Those were struggles within the social totality that tried to get some of the kernels of the founding project in 1776 and take them to what they saw as the logical and practical conclusion, which many of them saw it as socialism. So you have this one-sided view of America as a social totality that doesn't take into account the objective contradictions which exist, and how it is that these ought to be used, these must necessarily be used in order to re-articulate our people's consciousness towards socialism, right? If you go up to an American worker and you tell them that, everything that McCarthyism and anti-communism has told you about socialism is true, it actually is anti-American, and there's nothing in common with the traditions that you have grown up in and have embedded your life in, and socialism, they're not going to ride with you. They're going to walk you 10 feet away. They're not going to talk to you with a 10-foot pole. But if you tell them, look, there's this rich history of socialism that is ignored, whitewashed, and denigrated in our history books. And that history of socialism has seen that the values which you cherish and which the country was founded on, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right to revolution, national self-determination, government of, by, and for the people. These rights are unrealizable under the existing order, under the existent relations of production. And in order to actually achieve those concretely, we need socialism. That's a much more fruitful approach. So the purity fetish not only prevents those that have it from actually coming to know the world concretely and correctly, because they can't see contradictions, they can't see things in movement, they can't see things in process. It also prevents them from successfully organizing the working classes. It makes them revolutionary futile. And so it's not without reason that the dominance of this outlook in the West the places where this outlook has dominated has been the places where they have not been able to develop any substantial revolutionary movements over the last 100 years or more.
Well, you have that really interesting quote from Lenin when you're talking about national nihilism, where he, of course, is talking about the fact that the Bolsheviks have stood against the great Russian chauvinism, the crimes of the Tsar, the pogroms, the torture chambers. But he's also making a counterpoint to that and saying it's not that we as communists don't have a love for our homeland, our language, our culture, all these parts of this legacy, which we embrace and seek to make better under this new system. That's a very straightforward explanation of it. That also, interestingly enough, is a counterpoint to the Russian nationalists as well, but that's another story, and their view of Lenin, which is wholly wrong. But on the American question, and Britain as well, because your history and ours are, of course, very intertwined when it comes to the imperialist period. We get the same phenomena over here. People on the left, many of whom, by the way, have spent the last 3 weeks telling you to vote for the Labour Party, saying, this is a terrible place. Everybody is a white supremacist, even the people who aren't white. We will never see revolution because everybody's hooked into this terrible imperialist culture. The working class is hopelessly corrupted. We can't do anything. And that's a really great, again, as I said before, that's a great way of getting into the Guardian or the liberal press, actually, saying that. Because a lot of those people, again, supported an imperialist institution like the European Union. And so what it is, it's deliberate paralysis, because you have painted yourself into a corner. You can't approach the workers, as you say, with that message. No one's going to take you seriously, and rightly so. And yet at the same time, you can't go beyond this tiny agitational circle. So you're stuck. And I think it's a great way, a great trick for leading younger people in particular who are angry, rightly, and want to find answers into something which looks very radical, but in actual fact is objectively serving imperialism. You mentioned in the book that it's another form of like American exceptionalism.
Oh, yeah.
Believing that we are the worst nation. No one has ever been worse than us. It sounds like something that Trump would say, But I wonder your thoughts about that, about further taking that point further. I recently had this very baffling argument on Twitter, as all Twitter arguments are usually baffling. But when you say, as all communists should, I think, that you have to have an approach to people who are either recently went through the state forces, so army, police, other institutions, and came out the other side and might be bitter and angry and need some answers. You need to have we need to have an approach to those people. We also need to, when the situation gets more severe, have something of an approach to the people still inside those institutions who are come from working class families, who in the American case often come from minority families as well, and who are the sharp end of American capitalism. There needs to be an approach to reach those people, but the first response you get is always, no, this is all horrendous. You're a bunch of fascists for suggesting such a thing. So I wondered your thoughts on that. And like, does this purity fetish basically, is it set up to preclude any serious development that could actually take communist ideas into the areas they need to go to?
Oh, absolutely. And that's the second form. In the last chapter, I look at specifically the US. I develop, how it is that the objective conditions for revolution are here, which makes, these subjective flaws that are grounded on the purity fetish all the more dangerous. But I developed three forms, right? That position that the Western left takes to socialist countries, which it's just absurd. You have a working class that's been told that communism is evil every time it's been tried. And you're just going to tell them, yeah, that's all true. But we, the virtuous West, we're the ones that are going to get it right. It's absurd. We should be doing the opposite, telling them, look at the successes of socialism. We can do this too, if not much better, because those countries are doing it under the boot of imperialist hybrid warfare. The second form that it takes here, as I describe it, is what you're talking about, right? Which is which part of the working class is pure enough to be approached. And in the US, I think the dominant form that this has taken has been the rejection of the part of the working class that voted for Trump. They don't have the most perfect views on certain social issues because they don't meet the standard of purity. We cannot go organize them. And that ends up making communists then the people that just preach to the crowd. There's no way of building a successful communist movement if you are not bringing into the movement people who don't already agree with you. It's absurd to think about, but it's a phenomenon that takes place here in the U.S. and various communist organizations that see this part of the working mass as a fascist threat. As someone who has organized my whole organizing life in that part of the country that they're saying that these workers are presenting the fascist threat from, it's completely absurd because when I go up to them, I think that besides the most militant parts of the labor movement, they're the ones with the most advanced social consciousness. They're the ones that are wary of what they call the deep state and of globalists and all these things that are at its root really just capitalist imperialism. They're skeptical of news. They think that the news is lying to them in the interest of big monopoly capital or big pharma or the military or Wall Street or whatever. They have in various cases a tremendously advanced social consciousness that is very easily rearticulatable to socialism. It's very easy to take them from there to a proper Marxist analysis of society. And in many ways, when you do that, they're like, wow, you just gave me words for something that I already thought but didn't know how to articulate. And the question that you're bringing up with people who were formerly in the military or who are in the military and in these different offices that are basically, what Lenin called the armed bodies of men. These are recruited from the working class. In the U.S., in every high school, in every university, you have people giving out flyers for recruitment. They promise people that they're never going to be sent out. They tell them you're going to get a free education, right? They go to poor communities that can't afford an education. You'll get free education. You'll get a healthcare. You get everything that society denies you, and you won't get sent to war. Wow, that's wonderful, right? And that's wonderful. Yeah. So we had a situation like when I was an undergrad, most of the people that we were organizing with on the Bernie campaign and doing socialist activities in town, most of them were in the National Guard because of that. They otherwise wouldn't have been able to go to college. And these are people that had a longing to know. They read beyond class, which, now to get one of my students to even do the reading is insane. These people were not only doing that, but they were reading beyond class, Marxist theory and stuff. But they got enlisted to get an education. Halfway through, they get sent out to various parts, Qatar, various parts of the world. And boom, the education goes to shit. And the vast majority of the people that are in the armed forces in the U.S. It's a result of that. It's poverty. They're not able to meet the material and beyond material needs, and they are presented with this option that gives them everything that society should be providing for them, but is not. And it's quite intentional, so that people can continue enlisting in these bodies. And of course, we should be speaking out to these people. A lot of them are the ones that, because they're in the inside, they see how all of the actions that the U.S. takes abroad are based on lies, because they're there. And so you get some of the biggest spokespeople against the war, people like in the U.S., like Mike Preisner. Mike Preisner was someone that was in the Iraq war, saw the bullshit, came back, and it's one of the leading anti-war voices. How was it that the Bolsheviks won the revolution? They had to appeal to those armed bodies of men that then flipped and were essential for the Bolshevik revolution. It's been the same in other experiments. For instance, the Portuguese, right? The Portuguese revolution is thanks to the flip, what were at the time the armed bodies of the state, which were, of course, as always, recruited from the ranks of the working class. So that is definitely a manifestation of the purity fetish. There's a good portion of people that in the U.S. of the ultra left that say, these are just the foot soldiers of imperialism. I'm perfectly fine with the suicide rates that occur when they come back from war. I'm perfectly fine with their PTSD and their homelessness. I don't care. They deserve it because they're imperialist foot soldiers. And it's just completely absurd. It's a losing message that paints on, a very much conservative and reactionary at times worldview. It paints a radical gloss over it. And ultimately, again, not only prevents them from actually understanding things correctly, but from actually succeeding in the realm of practice. And to go back to, the question of how the national past is viewed, and you brought up American exceptionalism. It is a form of American exceptionalism that's glossed over through a form of self-flagellation and hatred, right? A sort of self-guilt, because it ends up being the case that, well, if socialism is this universal that in order to exist has to be concretized through the particular, that's just a basic way that dialectics understands the relationship of the universal to the particular, whereas philosophy before saw that the universal is that which exists in the same form across space and time. The universal's in one end and the particulars in another. They're separated very, very distinctively. The dialectical tradition says that no, there's a dialectical interaction between the universal and the particular, such that in order the universal is only that which is always concretized through the particular. That means that socialism, as this universal project, has to take different forms in the particular places it is being waged in. When it's done in the US, it means that we must look back at our history, we must look back at our progressive movements, and have develop Marxism in our context, what we've called sometimes American Marxism, which we see rooted in the analysis of W.B. Du Bois as the first person to properly grasp, the forms class struggle takes in the U.S. that are in part unique to the U.S. We need to develop a concrete analysis of our situation from the Marxist point of view. But socialism has to take an American form. And that's the analysis that Dimitrov provides in essence, in the place where he's talking about how it is that we fight fascism and Nazism, right? Socialism is the content that takes particular national forms. And if you have a big chunk of the left rejecting the progressive traditions of our country, reducing the history of our country to just the most evil things, you're not going to be able to realize this project of having the content be socialism and having that content take a determinate form in the American characteristics that it will necessarily take if it's going to arise.
Yeah, I mean, when you put it like that, and when you read how you put it in the book, it seems something which should be intuitive. It should be very much easy to grasp if you've taken the Marxist tradition seriously, if you've actually read how Lenin, Stalin, and others addressed the problem of the Communist parties organizing in the imperialist countries. They never went down the road of saying, no, all the working class are irredeemable, because they were serious people who thought there was a chance to build a revolutionary movement in this country, which of course there is. And a lot of this, of course, does come from, well, theorists like Marcuse, who in One Dimensional Man and then the later essay on liberation, he denied later that he decentered the working class, but in reality he had. He was saying it needed to be triggered by the lumpenized elements or racial minorities because it was hopelessly bought off, which showed he'd done no interrogation of the actual reality of American working class life at all. Because even in my own cursory readings of it, the New Deal mythology for 50s and 60s, this idea of capitalist prosperity, of welfare capitalism, it left a huge chunk of the American working class still poor and outside of the labor unions and living not exactly as they'd been in the 30s, but certainly not the ideal that the upper end of the working class did reach in that sort of 50s, 60s period. So maybe like a particularly well-paid Detroit car worker, for instance, had for a while, maybe, but most of the American working class was still poor. Like those Alabama miners were still poor. The people in what's it called, the old documentary Harlan County, USA, those miners that were on strike in the early 70s during the Nixon administration, all still desperately poor. So Marcuse had to ignore all of these contradictions and just focus on the most shallow thing possible, this most shallow analysis possible, to come up with this idea. And then it is embraced and repeated to death by all of his academic followers. But again, like any research into American working class life would show you that that's not true. And that, of course, even the part that he was referring to of the working class, that upper end, which was a minority, that's gone now. That's all gone. Like the well-paid single wage family, the Detroit car workers long gone, the well-paid steel workers long gone, and yet you get the left still repeating this idea that the American working class is still living as a minority of it was 60 years ago, and yet the fiction still retains itself. It's remarkable, really.
Right. It's a pseudo radical of trickle down economic, pseudo radical version of trickle down economics. Because you're in the empire, this is all trickling down to your working classes, and they're just completely bought off. And you know what Marcuse does with the working class is something that in general is done, of course, with socialist countries, where particular flaws are reified, they're taken away from their context. The paradox is, this is the guy that invents this very nice phrase, which is that you cannot understand facts separated from their factors. It's a nice play on words, right, that I use often. But that's what he does. He understands facts in a way that's separated, disconnected from the factors in which they're necessarily embedded. But he understands, he gets this small portion of the working class, which in the Leninist tradition we would call the labor aristocracy, which is not the whole working class, it's not every union worker, it's not the rank and file, it's the leadership of certain unions that have been bought off by imperialist super profits, and that go along with the projects of their national bourgeoisie, which in the case of our national bourgeoisie means going along with imperialism. So you have, for instance, various unions around that time that are supporting imperialist operations abroad. Right, the coup in Chile, for instance, was supported, I believe it was by the AFL-CIO, might have been by the United Auto Workers. You know, the same thing with the war in Vietnam. Right, it's a difficult situation, but that's not how the rank and file felt. That's not how the vast majority of workers in America felt. And you know, just the analysis that he provides is so unrooted in the Marxist tradition, because the proletariat is the revolutionary agent, not because they're the ones who are naturally disenchanted by the existing order or the most oppressed. The proletariat is the revolutionary agent of history because they're the one that in this mode of life produces surplus value. It is out of their labor that surplus value is extracted, and out of that extraction, capitalism is able to survive and, you know, do a variety of different things. So they're at the pressure points of capital, and that's why they are seen as primarily the revolutionary agents. That doesn't mean that other classes, other popular classes, can't be involved in the revolution. They should be, but it's not just that they're oppressed. That's not what leads them to being categorized by Marx as the revolutionary agent. It's because they create surplus value. So in that movement from like the working class to just minorities or the lumpen or the students, that is a turn away from Marxism. That's a turn away from a scientific understanding of capitalist society and what elements within this social totality point the way forward towards a new social totality. But we've had since that time where there was a development of a middle class that was primarily a phenomenon that occurred within the white part of the working class. It wasn't very prominent in the Black working class. Since that, we've had over the last 50 years, austerity, union busting, liberalization, deregulation, and just the destruction of the labor movement. We have, I think, 7 to 9% of workers are unionized. But in that 7 to 9%, the question that they don't ask is how many people are actually active? The vast majority of people are just paying union dues, and they're not active at all in any of the processes. So it's a very, very dire situation that the American people are in, not just in terms of their material conditions, where you have to work, if you're a family, 2 or 3 jobs, right, to survive, just to get by. But even the organs through which you can wage a fight for better conditions have been just completely obliterated. So we've had this phenomenon. The bourgeois theorists call it the destruction of the middle class. At the Institute, we've been referring to it through a concept that one of our leading theorists is a carpenter, or as much of an organic intellectual as you can get today. Noah Krashevik, he calls it reproletarianization. He sees that this part of the working class that was lifted up during that period of the development of the middle class has been reproletarianized. And this brings certain contradictions that we have to tarry with. For instance, the petty bourgeois consciousness that exists in various parts of the left, the sort of PMC engagement that is pretty much in most organizations in the left, if not all of them. This is a result of the fact that this class has been reproletarianized, but it has sustained some of the consciousness of its previous class, some of the ethical norms and ways of interacting of its previous class positions. And they're moving in ways that they want to oppose the system, but there's not that consciousness of the fact that their consciousness and a lot of times their material positions make it so that their natural inclinations end up just being towards these forms of political practices that are just, controlled counter-hegemony. And I bring up in the book the term of the iron triangle. Like they shape the political practices that they do outside through the way that they engage in relations through the iron triangle of the media, the NGOs, and the academy. And that working class people don't want to be, they don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. The same person, Noah, he's a member of the Communist Party. He's often asked, why don't you bring your coworkers, who he's gotten all of them to agree with the need of a Communist Party and with communism. Why don't you bring them to club meetings? He'd be embarrassed because they get there and it feels like an HR or diversity, equity, and inclusion meeting, right? And all of those things have to be overcome. There's material and ideological flaws within the organizations that would serve as the vehicle through which the subjective conditions for revolution would be developed. The material flaws are, of course, the class position of a lot of these agents within the PMC. And the ideological flaws are the ones that I tease out in the book, which is the purity fetish outlook, which prevents them, again, from not just understanding the world correctly through a dialectical materialist worldview, but prevents them from organizing workers.
Yes, and it also prevents them from actually drawing upon the positive examples that do exist in the world, not just historically, but currently. So even if we're talking about, you talk in the book about the objective situation inside the United States, heading towards a revolutionary situation due to the sheer decay of American capitalism. I mean, just look at the number of banks that are teetering on the edge of going under, or who have gone through a shotgun wedding to Goldman Sachs or something in the last just couple of weeks. Clearly, something major is brewing, not just in America, but most of the imperialist world. And yet, most of the left won't even look to other places to learn from them. So, like, if you talk about like the problems in both the United States and Britain, and in France, which is in tumult at the moment, you have the mass deindustrialization. You have the whole areas of the country that have never recovered from that. You have people, as you said, working 2, 3, however many temporary jobs just to try and make ends meet and feed their children. And then we as communists should not only have a response to that in terms of resistance, we should have a vision to give these people. And part of that must be inspired by the examples we've got, like, China overcoming feudalism and imperialism and achieving all the things that they have. The DPRK, we shouldn't be afraid to talk about that. The fact that they have been under siege for 70 years and have built everything that they have. The examples of working class power being exercised in places like Venezuela. And yet that purity fetish you identify would preclude most of the left referring to any of that. And they'll just say, resist in an abstract way, because they have no vision. And I would argue also part of this is that they have tacitly accepted decay. I think that you mentioned the whole iron triangle thing, the NGO at academy, in the academy, the NGOs are predicated now on getting budgets from the state to manage poverty for the state, I think, in a lot of American cities, from what I can see. It's a similar situation in Britain. So you got these vast homelessness areas, and rather than say, well, we need a radical program to rehouse these people and get them off whatever the hell they're addicted to and help them to be part of the working class again, it's no, we'll manage the situation, And of course, then that brings up the contradictions with the working class, who don't want the areas of their city like to be a homeless encampment, not because they don't care about these people, but because it brings all kinds of negative social consequences. And yet the left can't talk about that because there's no positive vision left anymore. It's just an embrace of capitalist decay, I think.
Absolutely. What's the Churchill phrase? Capitalism's the worst system, but it's the best one. It's better than all the alternatives. That's what the left ends up accepting here. And I would love for the working people in the United States to go to China, because you have like level 7, 8, it's level 7 rated provinces in China, like not major cities, not Shanghai, not Beijing. And they make New York look like a dump. They make the best cities in the United States look like a dump. These massive skyscrapers, people, 90% or so of people own their homes. The people that are renting out, it's like an extremely small percentage of their paycheck. The places that they live at are beautiful. There's access because they have extra income to do basically everything. And they're constantly developing and improving, whereas the stuff here is just completely decaying, and it's moribund. And there was a quote from Deng, and that's something along the lines of, we will show the superiority of socialism when regular people can just show up to the country and see with their direct engagements how socialism is superior. And you could do that today with China. There was a point in time before the overthrow of the Soviet Union where you could do it with the Soviet Union, and that boosted the movement for socialism here in the US, because you had leading Black intellectuals and radical intellectuals going to the Soviet Union and saying, this is awesome. This is unlike anything that we have back home. I don't feel racism here, and it's just incredible. You could do that now with China as well. And you're one of the things we do on our streams is often show comparisons between Chinese cities or Chinese train stations and American train stations, because those are all things that if the working people of our country saw, they would see that socialism is a viable alternative. A society that's ran by a communist party as the expression of the vanguard of the working class, it is an alternative that, even under the most conditions, a better form of life for them and their families and their loved ones. And the left cannot use that such powerful tool for organizing working people today. They can't use it because they reject China, because they see it as authoritarian capitalism or state capitalism or whatever. Or take the case of Cuba. Cuba is it's been kept poor and it's got a lot of difficulties, but look at what the people who go on brigades say. It's a wonderful society. It's wonderful, and it makes us rethink a lot of the assumptions that we had about Cuba and a lot of the assumptions that we had about our own country, or just regular tourists, people that are not going on brigades. So when you reject the actual experiments that have been embarked on to construct socialism, and you do that from a country where the big lie has been that socialism has never worked, it just leads to genocide and poverty and making everyone poor, you're never going to be able to succeed. You're never going to be able to succeed. And we have to succeed. We have to succeed. Our rulers are literally taking us to the precipice of nuclear Armageddon. They don't care. They're willing to do everything to sustain a hegemony that is very clearly crumbling. There's estimates that in terms of international trade, less than 30% of it is going to be done in the dollar by 2030. Dollar hegemony is dying. It's dying. Out of that comes the power to sanction economies and to do a big chunk of the things that are most essential for the imperialist toolbox. So it's a dying society that working people are feeling here at home. And, part of what the left does here is, specifically some communist organizations, it criticizes Biden's foreign policy, not often very correctly, but it criticizes the foreign policy, but then praises the national stuff, what it does at home. And it's absurd because again, you're not thinking dialectically. The foreign policy and the national policy, you can't separate the one from the other, especially when, our country is the imperial hegemon of the global world. And so if the ruling class cannot ruin the old way internationally, they can't do so nationally either, right? You're seeing the big splits within the ruling class, and you're seeing that 20% of the population approves of what Congress does regularly. 60-something%, actually close to 80%, are disenchanted by the two-party system and want third-party alternatives. What does that mean? Well, that the population itself is not ready to continue in the old way. And with this, you have the material conditions that are getting more and more difficult for regular people. Well, all of those factors are the ones that have been traditionally considered by the Marxist-Leninist left the key components of assessing whether we are in an objective revolutionary condition or not. And we meet every single one. What we're missing is an organization that has ideological clarity, that's not burdened by its PMC aura and by the purity fetish, and that can get to the massive people and organize them in a revolutionary manner. People have been showing that they want something new and they're willing to act on it. We had close to 30 million people in the streets, the largest protests in American history, 2 years ago, which were the George Floyd protests. And, you had people of all creeds, and the anger wasn't just at the lynching of George Floyd, which was horrific. It was an anger that was aimed at the system, but that didn't have a vehicle towards which it could direct that movement towards actually opposing the existing order. And so it ended up just sort of getting absorbed in the vote for Joe Biden thing. So we need these organizations to be built. And insofar as the vehicles which can serve these functions continue to tell people we have this fascist threat with Trump, therefore we have to vote for Joe Biden. And it doesn't matter if, we tiptoe into nuclear Armageddon, the death of humanity, the destruction of the planet, at least we'll have a president that is a little better on like LGBTQ issues, right? Insofar as that continues to be the case, we're doomed. And there's organizations here that have a lot of resources, that have international recognition, that have a lot of potential if they were doing the right things and not guided by the purity fetish, a lot of potential to organize the American people in a revolutionary manner and make a difference. The material's there. And, it's very sad that there's conditions that are not allowing these organizations to function as the vanguard vehicle that they can function as. But everything is subject to flux, and everything can change at any moment. And what we're sure of is that the consciousness of the American people, regardless of what region of the country you're in, whether you're in the more liberal coastal areas or in the more conservative central areas of the country, the consciousness of the American people is such that they are tired of the way things are. They want a radical change in their everyday life, and they are consistently being hidden from any alternatives. They don't know what an alternative looks like, and we can provide that only if we remove the purity fetish.
Exactly, and that's a very good way to bring our discussion to a close, Carlos. It's been an excellent run through of a lot of really interesting issues that you bring out in the book. The book is called The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. It's available in many good bookshops and several less good ones as well. But Carlos, it's been a really interesting hour here. Thank you for coming on today, and we hope you'll join us again at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you again for such a wonderful conversation.
Okay.